What happens when the man who spent decades helping others heal suddenly finds himself fighting a battle he never saw coming? After surviving childhood rejection, abuse, broken identity, and years of personal healing, my guest today believed he understood trauma. Then, a shocking heart diagnosis changed everything. Despite doing all the right things for his health, he found himself facing open heart surgery, emotional darkness, and a level of grief he never expected. Today, Mike's going to share how gratitude and grief can exist at the same time, and why healing isn't always a one-time event, and what God taught him as he walked through the valley he never thought he would face. Have you ever wanted to hear God's voice more clearly and grow in your faith? Sacred Pathways is a free mentorship experience inside the Transformation Academy at It's Your Story to Tell. Each week, you'll receive 3 short lessons, a guided playlist for reflection, and the opportunity to join a monthly group coaching call. If you're ready to deepen your relationship with God and become more of who He created you to be, visit itsyourstorytotell.com. Explore the Transformation Academy and join Sacred Pathways today. Welcome to the It's Your Story to Tell podcast. I'm your host, Megan Babcock. This podcast is a place where people share the hard parts of their story and how God has redeemed them, because when we stop hiding our struggles and start sharing our journey, we give others permission to heal too. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining me today. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Oh, so am I. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Well, Mike is an entrepreneur. He owns a fitness franchise and most recently the author of The Shadow. So I'm going to let you just jump right in, Mike, and start telling us a little bit about your story, because when we first met, you were talking to me about how your story goes all the way back to before you were born.
It does. You know, it's something about all that. My mom, I was born in 1960. My mom became pregnant. My biological father, when he found that out, he left. But she was faced with a decision. My grandparents, I guess they had a meeting of some sort. And she felt that it'd be better to abort the child, which of course was me. So she traveled across state lines. She was in Illinois. I think she went to Kentucky, probably took a bus. And when she arrived, she ended up running into a woman named Lena Niner. I tried to look this woman up. She may be already gone, but I couldn't find her. It would have been nice to thank her, right? But she talked my mom out of it. I don't know what that conversation was. I don't know if it was spiritual. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it made my mom choose a different course. And, to understand back in those times, obviously divorce, single parent, that's a much different time than it is now, where it's become more accepting, more kind of normalized in some ways. So it was a tough decision, I'm sure, for her to go on and have me, right? So I think, studies show that even in the womb, you can play music, you can do all sorts of things, how it affects the child positively, but it also negatively can affect a child as well. So I believe, I was really birthed in rejection. My mom was molested. My grandma was molested. Unfortunately, I faced some things early on in my life. So it's interesting about a generational line, it seems like, in a negative way. And I think all those things affected me early on because I just didn't know who I was. And you're always searching for that person. Really, you don't even know what they look like, to be honest with you, right? You're just you just know what you feel is not right. And you don't feel like you belong. You feel like you're probably a round peg in a square hole, so to speak. And somehow, how do you fit into this life? So I think it was a struggle all the way from the beginning, to be honest with you. My mom had narcolepsy till I was 12 years old. So it just exacerbates the situation of being alone. And that's what rejection feels like, right? It feels like you're alone. You're by yourself. And so I think it just made things very difficult, for sure.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that those early experiences, yes, they impacted you while you were growing up and as a child, but that they impacted your relationships long term.
They did. I mean, I think it's interesting. My mom was really searching for the answers. She did the Gene Dixon, which is kind of the stars. We were Jehovah's Witnesses for a while. I can remember the early age. I was going door to door with watchtowers. So she was searching for the answer, but didn't have that answer. So I went to vacation Bible school. I didn't grow up in church. One season, one summer. That's the only exposure I probably had to maybe what the gospel was about. But I guess I just probably knew there was God that was there, knew about Jesus, but no relationship with him. I don't think I understood him. I probably thought him as the lightning bolt God that when you got out of line, he kind of whacked you around. That's kind of how I viewed it. So in 1980, I had an encounter with God. I mean, a dramatic encounter. It was in a Denny's late night one time, and I was pretty stoned at the time. And some people were in a booth and they were praying. And out of my mouth kind of came a statement almost like a hallelujah or something, which would not normally come out of my mouth. I could tell you at that time of my life. And they looked up at me and they called me over there. They were not judgmental at all. They heard me and they invited me to church and I ended up getting saved. And it was just life changing for me. I moved, felt like God just separated me and set me free from drugs and alcohol. There were some other things I had in my life that I really wasn't aware of. I mean, I was just really on fire for Jesus for 6 months and just really tuned in. But no one ever really talked to me about, they didn't disciple me. No one talked to me about what to do. Again, I didn't grow up in that environment, so I didn't know what to do. And that may sound strange to some people, like you think you should know, but I didn't. Right. I didn't know what being a Christian was about or what it looked like. And then I fell 6 months later. I ended up in a situation that was it was just sin. We'll put it that way. And I ended up meeting with the pastor and I had told him, and it was a pretty wild event, I guess. And I don't think he knew how to take it. And I walked out. He never prayed with me. He never said you could be forgiven. He never talked about repentance. And so for me, I think it just began to drive even deeper about how I now not only blew it in my life in all these ways, but now I blew it with God. And I felt like, again, it just deepened my aloneness. And, you're trying to do life on your own. You're trying to be moral, right? You're trying to be good. But there's this nature in you that keeps driving you the wrong way, right? And you just can't overcome that. And that didn't really change till 13 years later. So for 13 years, I walked along knowing God existed, prayed many times. I call it foxhole pray, probably in those moments, when things are going wrong. But it didn't really change until November 17th of 93 when I rededicated my life. That's when things really changed. So, I mean, I can elaborate on that if you'd like for me to. So,
Tell me a little bit about your relationship journey. When we spoke before, you were sharing about how it impacted self-worth that led to other difficult relationships, not just with God or people from the church, but also really close personal relationships.
Well, I got married early. I was married in 1982. That was my first marriage. And it was a marriage that I stood before God, but I didn't really ask God about because, again, I didn't even understand how all that worked, right? And that seemed to start well, but the problem is when there's a lot of brokenness and insecurities, again, looking back, I can identify those things, but in those moments, you don't know, you don't define them that way, right? You're just trying to operate out of who you are when you don't know who you are, right? And out of that brokenness, you're trying to love people, but you don't love yourself. So it's really kind of a very topsy-turvy type of thing, and it never seems to work. So that relationship didn't end well. It became an abusive relationship, not on my side, but on hers. She became an alcoholic. It was pretty bad at the end. Unfortunately, even after we got divorced, she ended up passing away due to alcohol. So it tells you how severe that really was. But it affected that relationship because it was just never whole. For me, I was always looking, even in my marriage, I wasn't not perfect. I look for ways to cope, whether that was alcohol, women, it was many different things, right? Because these things create a hole inside of you. When we're born, we're born into sin right off the bat, right? And so we have a hole that obviously is deficient of our Father, our true Father, which is in heaven. So there's already that void of him, that longing for that purpose of being a part of God's family, in essence, right? So what happens is, and at least in my case, and in many people's cases, we're trying to fill that hole with all sorts of other things. And that could be success as well. I've chased the corporate carrot. Unfortunately, I'm one of those people that seem to have done everything to try to fill those holes. And even as a believer, I was chasing a corporate carrot because success, there's nothing wrong with. right? But it can skirt lines to where it becomes a replacement for your relationship with God, and it becomes to begin to appease you somehow. And that's where it becomes a God in essence, right? To have no gods before me. So I think it affected a lot of relationships. I don't think I ever knew what a relationship was, to be honest with you. I think they were just all acquaintances. I did not know what intimacy was. I had no idea. As a man, men typically think that's just sex, but it's not. It's just so much deeper than that. But if you have all these voids in your life, you don't know how to even attain those things. Like you don't even understand how is that even possible to move into that level. And until your heart starts getting healed, it's going to be very, very difficult to ever receive the fullness of what God has for you in those areas in that category. So yeah, it affected everything I touched. I mean, it just did. So
I can identify with that on so many levels. One, just not understanding that there were hard things or traumatic things in my life, and then trying to make my life look what I thought a good Christian, a good mother, a good wife, success in my career. All of it just trying so hard to be seen and accepted by others or have people be proud of me for the accomplishments. Meanwhile, it was so dark and I was so desperate and very frustrated, honestly, where it was like, I feel like I am trying so hard to do the right thing, and yet my life is a disaster. I didn't know how to stop it. I was on a hamster wheel that I felt like if I were to try and get off and try to figure out what was going on, all the balls would drop. I would be exposed. And at one point it did happen where I had to come to the end of myself and recognize that all of the things I was doing were me. I was trying to do it. That's why I was so tired and I was so exhausted. And it was on the bathroom floor where I finally just cried out, I can't do this anymore. It wasn't like I wanted to die in that moment, but it was just, I had no idea how to keep going or exist. And I didn't want the life that I was living. And when I cried out, though, I got some direction. And I think you've probably got some direction all along your journey, which we'll talk even more about as you've written your book. But it wasn't really the miracle that I was crying out for. Ultimately now sitting on this side 10 years from when that happened, I can see it was the best advice and exactly what I needed. But it was take your thoughts captive. Measure them against the fruits of the Spirit. And if they don't line up, you need to make different choices. And I'm like, how long is this going to take for me to climb out of this hole if I have to take the thoughts in my head captive? Because there were thousands and it was so chaotic and so loud. I don't know if that resonates with you or if you had any similar experience, but tell me about how you kind of came to a place where you were ready to try something different.
Yeah. It's something as you were talking, I think about this is that I don't pretend to understand all these things, right? I know we're born in sin and we have a sin nature and all those things, but it seems that why many people can't seem to end up getting to the bottom of themselves without some sort of crisis. It's not always that way, or it doesn't have to be that way, but sometimes it just seems it's that way. I don't think it's not God's design to be that way. Sometimes I think people think God's just laying all these things out and eventually we'll just become broken. And this is all part of kind of the plan. That's what he had. I don't see it that way. I don't completely understand how it happens. As a father, I would never do that to my kids, right? So I know that from the character of God's standpoint, it probably grieves him to watch us go through these things, but he sees something we just don't see, right? And when we have that moment, like you described, or then, as the song says, I once was blind, but now I see. The thing is about seeing, though, is it's not like you said, it's not like I'm seeing everything, but I'm seeing enough that sheds enough light to do what it needs to do in that moment that then breeds more light to shed more light on the areas that need to have light on them. And it becomes a sanctification process. When you talked about taking your thoughts captive, I can remember when I rededicated my life November 17th of 93, my thoughts were like that too. It was just crazy. I mean, at the time, there was just so much going on. My wife was with other men. I had my kids. It was just a brutal, brutal time. It did not get better after November 17th. It did in some ways, but the exterior side did not. It got worse. It got more to contend with. But thank God he was now guiding me. And it's hard to understand all that. But that moment, what he told me was I had to stop blaming. I had to stop blaming the people in my past for my life. Stop saying I had, I always felt like I had a raw hand. And it's not the cards, it's the person holding the cards, right? And this recently came to me. I had completely forgot it. You go back, sometimes you just miss the things. But what happened the night before was I was drinking in my house. We never drank in our house. And I was having a beer in my house. And I asked my kids to give me a beer. I'm telling you, I would have never done this ever. This is about 12 years being married. My kids, I don't remember how old they were at the time. I can still see this picture to this day. They're in the kitchen and they're right by the refrigerator. And my son says, Dad, I thought you said you were going to stop drinking. And my daughter says, it's okay. He's upset. And the next morning I woke up and all I could think about was, what am I teaching my kids? And so that started my moment on the couch of repentance to say, God, take my life, this mess that I've created, and whatever you can do with it, do whatever you will. And then the next thing I heard was I had to stop blaming. So for me, that was very impactful to take now personal responsibility. Did people harm me along the way? Or, of course they did. Do people do that in our lives? Of course they do. Do they do it intentionally? Some may. But the bottom line is that that's affecting my heart. Now, that's on them. But it's me. All this stuff I was going through, I was in such rage. I mean, I would get out and beat on people's cars. I mean, I had a lot of hate inside of me from all these things. And God had to begin to clean it up. And he did it by that one comment that I had to stop blaming it. I was prepared to do whatever. And now you go back to 1980, no discipleship. This time I decided I'll do whatever it takes. I plugged myself in church. I began to read my Bible. I mean, I did whatever it took to really foster that relationship with him. And reading the word was huge. I read John one chapter a night. I was not a reader. One chapter a night. I read John. I read Acts. When I hit Romans, it was like the Bible just started jumping off the page and all I could see was me. And it just began to wash me. So it was very impactful. And I think born again moments, people have them, right? I mean, I can remember my day. I don't think it's important that people have to remember the exact day, but there should be a moment, a defining moment in someone's life to know, wow, something shifted that day. And that's what happened, sounds like, for you. And it also happened for me. And I've been on that journey now. That was 1993. So that's whatever the math is. That would be almost coming up on 33 years. It's hard to believe. So,
Wow. When you were talking about the moment that you realized what you were passing down to your child or your children, the moment before I was on the bathroom floor was because I realized I was passing down what had been passed down to me. And my son, we were going through some really hard stuff. I was leaving an abusive marriage and he was crying and I needed to leave the house. I needed to get my sister. She had come to help me. It was Mother's Day weekend and I needed to get her to the airport. And he was about fifth grade. And so he was going to be there with his sisters while I ran and did that. And he was just so emotional. And I said to him, stop crying or I'm going to take your phone away. And in that very moment, like I was transported back to a time in my childhood, about 7 years old, where my grandfather, who I adored and always did and felt very close to him, but he told me as he was very angry leaving the room, stop crying. It's just a movie, for heaven's sakes. And in that moment, I realized I had become the person I said I never want to be. I wanted to be a safe person for people. I loved people. I was always giving and wanting to see people heal. I was the person who wanted to tutor people in the neighborhood and volunteer, like to help take care of things, and even became a nurse, to be able to help continue to take care of people. But I didn't know how to do it in a healthy way because I was never taught it. And even though I grew up in church and I was on the Bible quiz team, where you jump up and you say the verses when they give you the reference and see who can say it first. And I knew scripture, but what I realize now is I used scriptures to spiritually bypass what I was feeling. So I think it's so important. We were talking in the intro about how grief and gratitude, how more than one feeling can exist in a moment. Like my son could be sad and I could still be grounded and not thinking that I'm a terrible mother because his emotions, which is what was happening in me. And I really had to start learning how to regulate my emotions. But before I could even do that, I had to even learn how to name my emotions. Like you talked about having rage, there were so many things that, you might think, oh, I was a very calm person, but not on the inside. Like I was raging on the inside and it would show up as perfectionism and cleaning the house and trying to make everything look right. But ultimately, there were ugly things that were going on in my heart that I didn't want to expose. And it was that exposing that God was like, we're going to have to go back into those places. We're going to have to see what happened in those moments and what did you choose to believe? You talk about not being a victim. You can be a victim of something happening and not live in victimhood, where it continues to impact you. And that's also where I was looking at everybody else. And he's like, you're going to have to start making some choices because this relationship that's toxic that you're in, you're half of the equation. Like you're also contributing to this being unhealthy. And ultimately, he even exposed to me, which it was crazy because like you, I had always thought of this like when you're bad and he's going to bring the hammer, the lightning. And it wasn't like that. Actually, his voice was so kind and so compassionate. It was the enemy who was using the shame to keep me stuck because when God showed me, I was praying, why won't you save my marriage? Like you say, like marriage is a good thing. And he showed me, well, we all have free will. And so I can't force your husband to a healthy marriage. And then he said to me, and you're abusive too. And I was like, what? Me? I mean, I'm a people pleaser. I'm always walking on eggshells. I'm trying to make sure everyone's happy. And he said, all abuse is taking away someone else's free will. It doesn't have to look violent. It doesn't have to be yelling. But if you aren't being honest and you're trying to manipulate the circumstances around you in order to get your desired outcome, which is not to have conflict and all of these things, you're not doing it in a way that allows the other person to make a choice and have free will. And I was like, but at the same time, I didn't feel that judgment that I had felt. I just felt like I'm showing you something so that you can change it. Because like you, I didn't know all these things that had been programmed into me that were causing me to get this life that I didn't want. Right. And so I had to learn to do something different. And that's the journey that I was on with him and learning about who he was and his character and being able to start recognizing that judgmental voice was not his. Right. He likes to gently convict us, but he always also makes a way when we respond.
That's right. I think it's something because as your story and mine is that we didn't understand who God really is, right? That's a big part of the equation. And I think when you go through these things, it can either repel you from God or it can draw you to God. It's going to be one of the two. And I've asked this question. I met with a guy the other day and he remembered the question. It was something I hadn't asked him for a long time. And the question is this: do you think God is surprised when you get something wrong? Or do you think God's surprised when you get something right? And it's a question that you should think about because I think many times that we think that God is surprised when we get something right. But see, that's just not how he thinks. He knows how he's created us to be. So for him, he's always, think about 1 Corinthians 13. Love always believes the best. It always is that higher level. So I think it's more that God is surprised when we get something wrong, not when we get something right. So I think it's perspective of who God is. And I think that's something that really God sounds like for both of us. He was bringing us into the light of who his true character is. And the more that we learn his true character, the more comfortable we become on laying our life out for the loving Father to come in and do the things that need to be done in our life to truly open up. And it's interesting you talk about taking away free will, because in these relationships, in all actuality, even in my first marriage, I wasn't me. I was only the facade of me that whatever I needed to do to keep things wherever they may be. And this is what happens in relationships. If this goes on in people's lives, you really aren't getting the real person. You're only getting, if you begin to become that way, that person will begin to adapt. And that means you really don't have that real person. And if you don't have that real person, then you don't have the fullness of their love, because they're always going to be guarding in some way. And the other thing I think about too is in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were moved out of the garden, I think if people ask this question too, how do you view God removing them out of the garden? And if you view them as God screaming at them because they sinned, get out, or do you see it the way it really is, which he said he removed them out of the garden to protect them so they wouldn't eat of the tree of life and be eternally damned? It's two concepts of who God is. The one is truth and the other is lie. And the enemy is always trying to come with the lie approach. I mean, if you go to Jesus, I just read about it today. He's in the wilderness. He's tempted 3 times. And the first, he always says, if you be the son, if you be the son. He's always trying to challenge what the truth really is, right? So, and these are just like my book. It's what we're talking about. These are shadows that try to come on us and deceive us to think God is one way when he's really not. He's somebody else. If we're not walking in healing, then he must not be the healer, because why am I not walking in healing? I could say that in my life. But the thing is, he still is the healer. It's just our perspective is that healing is like now, like instantaneous. Like if I have a bum foot, that my bum foot should no longer be a bum foot because I'm already healed. And it doesn't always work that way. And this is where you have to put trust in the one who is the creator and understand that he has it. And these processes that he guides us down are never meant to harm us, and they aren't always designed by him. There's an enemy out there as well, right? And so I think sometimes this is where God gets to blame, like a marriage fault. There's like, why? I just talked to this guy the other day, and I asked him when he had his moment with Jesus, and he was telling me that many years ago, his wife, who was his rock, they've been together for half their life. He's going to be 40. She had a stroke. And for him, he got mad at God, and because he felt like God was doing something to the one he loved. Right. Now he sees it differently, right? But this is what happens. Death happens, loss happens, trauma happens, and then it becomes God's issue. It becomes him that did it. The very one and the only one that can actually heal us of that trauma is the one that we stiff arm. And who is speaking in our ear? But the shadow of death of the enemy, all along the way. I do watch movies. I don't I don't watch a lot of them, but I know the Wonder Woman movie, the new one, I think 1984 or whatever. But it shows. So I think it was the guy of war or whatever it was, and it showed him. He goes, "I didn't do anything. I just whispered in their ear." And that's who the enemy is. He's a whisperer. And that's what he was doing in our lives all along the way, all the way back for me as a child, all the way back and even in your life. He just kept whispering and feeding into those things that were inside of us. And then they just become strongholds inside of us. And the word stronghold is a thinking that we have. And interesting, Romans 12:2 says, don't be conformed to this world's way of thinking, right? But be transformed by the renewing of that mind, which breaks that stronghold down. So it's really something and very perplexing. I don't pretend to understand it, but I do understand this, that God is a loving Father that doesn't want us to feel the way we feel, and he wants to bring us through that. However, we do have emotions, and I think God helped me to identify what those emotions are many times. Disappointment, when I feel that, when I get my feelings hurt. I mean, these are things that I think you have to identify. I don't know that I don't like to stereotype, but I've just found I've had to work really hard as a man to try to get a hold of this stuff. It is just not easy. And I talk to a lot of people, and typically they don't really know how they're feeling, right? But I think it's an integral part to our relationship to understand that, because these become markers, right? Like if I become defensive or I get my feelings hurt, I I have to own that. I need to understand what's going on in that. What got challenged inside of me to allow it to happen. And that's before the Holy Spirit, right? So I think just going through stuff and not calling it anything, I think it's just not the proper way, because that's what I did. I stuck my emotions all my life, right? So understanding those, God gave them to us. And to go back, like when we talked about in my story about grief and gratitude in the same hand, something really God had to show me, because I'm feeling something that to me was not godly. It's not righteous. How could I feel this way? Why am I feeling this way? For me, coming out of a lot of counseling and trauma myself, helping other people, and I had all the tools, but there was no root to it. Like many times there is, but in my case, it was an event. And in that event, it caused a lot of trauma in me. Now, could that have triggered from all the way in the back? All that stuff is healed in my life. So I'm not going to completely understand all that, but it was pretty rough stuff. I mean, it just really messed me up emotionally to face my mortality. It's not something that everyone faces, you will face, but I had to face that. And with that came some really emotional stuff. So.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in part 2. And I just think that's a perfect lead in. So thank you so much for sharing. Listeners, I think probably so many of you have been able to identify with this conversation. And maybe there's something that you're thinking, gosh, maybe I do have trauma, or maybe there is sort of agreement or belief that I have that is keeping me stuck. Come back and let's hear a little bit more from Mike. I'm so excited to talk about this because I love when we learn from our triggers. So we'll talk about that in this next part. Thank you, Mike, for being here.